Thank you very much for your presentation, Tamara. I'm really happy to engage in conversation over this topic because it's so very important, it's so very timely. There are tangible results to the research you've done, so that's great. And your study really brings to light the invisible aspects of women's military engagement, the legal and infrastructural challenges women face, and the ways they adapt to these mostly male environments and spaces. They struggle and sometimes get recognition that they deserve. To my knowledge, the Invisible Battalion study is the first academic study of women's participation in the ATO zone. So that's great that you took it on. And my first question has to do with shifting gender identities in Ukraine. From the existing literature, we know that after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a reinterpretation of gender identities towards more traditional ones. Men increasingly assuming the role of breadwinner, women dropping out of the market, being relegated to domestic sphere. And in your paper, you say that mothers and beautiful women are two major gender-based roles available for women in Ukrainian society, and other roles are marginalized, not as socially centered. So to what extent do you feel that has changed in post-Maidan Ukraine? Do you feel that these new forms of engagement, military engagement, are becoming more central to the ways women are perceived in Ukrainian society and also the ways they position themselves? Or is it something still pretty much on the periphery, and remains valid only to the group of women you studied? So just bringing it to a larger scale, I guess.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's really, you made this point quite clear that really after collapse of Soviet Union, this gender contract of so-called working mother, where state very actively involved women as reserve labor force to different spheres of public spheres. It changed and diversified a lot. And besides being mothers and those who are involved in labor market, women are supposed also to be beautiful, because beauty and visuality is another, I would say, one of the notion of femininity. And we could see that still, even in around military discourse on Maidan, that these visions sometimes prevail and stereotypes prevail, because recently on the holiday of Ukrainian defender, some military units or parts of Ministry of Defense, they, for example, organized beauty contests for combatant women. Actually, there is this so-called, besides our calendar, where we try to show women not as like beautiful objects who are also fighting, but as those who are making their dreams, who are fulfilling their wish and role. We could see that still there is this so-called pin-up art, where women are very sexualized and where they are disseminating among male soldiers for their satisfaction. But at the same time, despite the fact that these stereotypical roles they prevail, where I see changes that they are heavily criticized very often immediately, and there is this critical group of some people, some initiatives who see these problems and who start dialogue and who criticize and point to Ministry of Defense that, for example, it's very problematic to organize this beauty contest. So I would say that, and now there are more initiatives where women are also positioned on the, I would say, roles as those who do their career, or who are more like public feminists. So I would say that these roles, they are diversified, And another issue, what about men's roles? If men are allowed not to go in army or to be daddies, yet to cook borscht, because we can't fight only for women's choice to either to cook borscht or to die on barricades. We are also in an egalitarian society. We should fight for men to have the choice not to go on the army if they don't want, but to choose, for example, to do reproductive labor. And I think with masculinity is much tougher. In this heroic and this heroism still, we could see that this hegemonic masculinity, it doesn't have much room for different diverse roles for men.
And just to follow up on my first question and what you had to say in response, I got a very positive vibe reading your paper, even though you talk about the challenges women face and that there is still lots of work to be done. At the same time, you show that there are no new institutional spaces opening up for women, that there is some evolution happening, and that Ukraine committed to reforms in the defense and security sector. So that's a source for optimism, I guess. And I'm working on voluntary networks at the rear. So I study voluntary groups that emerged amidst the war on Donbas to help the army, to take care of the wounded and everything. And my observations are somewhat less optimistic. I found in my interviews, like these recurrent discourses that, well, warfare is exclusively men's business, that women should stay behind, women shouldn't be at the front lines. Again, these essentializing discourses that men and women have different roles because they are different by nature, right? And I felt that that's a rising trend among volunteers. A lot of them told me that they've come to that conclusion through recent voluntary engagement. So I'm wondering whether you were able to make any observations about interactions between these female volunteers, female combatants, the way female combatants are treated once they're back at home, once they're demobilized. What is the perception? How are they perceived?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm optimistic in my paper because what empowers me is that our respondents, they by themselves want to fight. They see discrimination. Most of them, they could recognize it, and they want to fight to change situation. And I think it's very wonderful when not we as researchers come to some discriminated groups and we point out that there are problems with you. So that is why I'm quite optimistic, because they even sometimes organize some small protests to Ministry of Defense. But at the same time, you're right. Women in general, I would say, according to different public opinion surveys, sometimes women even more traditional and patriarchal than men. And there are also a group of women who prefer to do more reproductive labor. But I think that in general in society it's more complicated than we think, because these identities sometimes are multiple, and even those women who do more reproductive labor at the same time, they may do some other, like either decision making or be involved in some more I would say other types of work. What I see as a problem with women, even with my respondents, is the fact that women have lower self-esteem. They underestimate their role. They may say that it's not work that they are doing, but they help. This discourse, even in the like we could go back to Orange Revolution or others, where what are the role of women? If they are those who are doing revolution or who are helping. And the problem is that even this backstage so-called role, that is very important, because Euromaidan, it's not only fights on barricades, but all other type of work that persists to this 3 months protest. But women somehow undervalue. this work. And it's in general problem with Ukrainian society perception of different type of work and reproductive, this so-called reproductive labor, with raising other members of society, caring of other. I think in general it's underestimated, and that is a problem also.
I was wondering if you could also comment a little bit about the public campaign related to the study, where you presented your research. What was the reaction to the idea of female military service, whether your respondents attended, so.
Yeah, thanks a lot. We presented it a bit less than 1 year ago in Kiev and in other cities. I think the most successful, as of consequences, was our presentation in Dnipro, because we have also some respondents from Dnipro, and as a result of this communication with this woman, we have even NGO of female veterans of ATO. And of course, these presentations, they somehow received quite active attention from media. And women, they were attending this. They were eager to talk. And some of them now became quite, I would say, public, some of them public figure, despite the fact that from the very beginning they were hesitant to provide to show publicly their role or not, because as we know in general in society, as with the Second World War, if we go back to the Second World War, where a lot of women were participating, but then when they back to their places, somehow in the memories, and they can't talking very openly on this, because there are a lot of stereotypes what they were doing on this front. And mainly, I think stereotypically, people think that women have more like individual motivation and men have more patriotic. But what we could see from our interviews that women could have both, and also this patriotic motivation to defend their country. But there is the stereotype that women are coming to find husband or whatever, like to find true hero in front, and that is why. And also when they leave their children somehow in ordinary life, then they could be misunderstood and perceived as bad mothers. And there were even one case when social services proposed one of our respondents to say that she refused from her child, and after this they will take it under its protection. So this notion for women, it's much harder, especially those who have children, to be in front lines.
Let's take questions from the audience. Victoria, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I really
Your
enjoyed
hands
this.
raised, please, so they can.
Yeah, thank you. I was really interested to know about the impact of this 39th Sotnya. Was it, in terms of its the consequences of its existence, did it have outcomes on the battlefield, on the front line, or was the significance really in terms of changing people's identities, changing women's identities, their traditional roles? And a second quick question. Unfortunately, in the UK, if you're a woman, if you're in the armed forces, in those kind of frontline roles, there's a very strong likelihood that you're going to, unfortunately, encounter some kind of sexual harassment, sexual abuse. I wonder if there was any tales of that, and whether there was facilities for dealing with those kind of reports. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Actually, the 39 Sotnya, it's another. I could also criticize it in a way that it's the only one officially registered Sotnya, and there were a number of unofficial, like first also paramilitary units, like first Sotnya of Maidan, but for example in Ternopil, or even in Kiev, like more self-organized, not official. And in this traditional military discourse, to be recognized, you should be in official structure, actually. And this, the leader of this Sotnya, Anna Kovalenko, I think she is like daughter of one of the also of other combat in self-defense structure, but they showed that it's possible to do. I think what was their role, that they showed that women want to be on barricades, even despite the fact that on Euromaidan, women were a number of times asked as children to leave Maidan during dangerous times at night. So women showed that they want to be, that they can be. And later, this Sotnya was very present also on Facebook, and they mobilized some also volunteer things. Some of them went probably, some went to later in NATO. But I think discursively, of course, it's very important to see that from one hand, Maidan was sexist, but at the same time, it also was inclusive in a way that it provided the space for women as a group to be present. As for sexual violence and sexual harassment, Ministry of Defense provided us the internal research, public opinion surveys of their staff, and around 10% of women, they said that they face sexual harassment in armed forces. And unfortunately, in Ukraine in general, sexual harassment is a very taboo topic, even in labor market. And for me, as a researcher, it's also important to show that, like, armed forces, it's like labor market, and the number of problems that women, that people face, women and men, it's also general for wider labor market. And actually, I believe that the major issues that women fight for is their labor rights. First of all, of course, it's also like ideological recognition, but it's labor rights. But in general, we didn't ask our respondents on sexual violence, because it's quite a sensitive topic to ask in one interview. No one told particularly on this, but of course there are sometimes some so-called sexualized attentions, but I think it's a bit other, so it's some further research that we should do.
Thank you.
Tamara, thank you so much. I'm curious whether in any of the interviews, discussions with women in active military service, Nadia Savchenko has popped up as a role model or as an anti-role model to follow. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I didn't have time to talk on Nadia Savchenko, but of course, ideologically, she helped us a lot in our research. Absolutely. She helped a lot. She wrote her book of memoir, where she's actually telling all these gender discriminations that she faced. She wanted to be pilot, and due to her will, she asked for personal audience with former Minister of Defense, Ritsenko, and he allowed, due to her personal, I would say, initiative, 2 professions were added to the list of allowed professions, pilot and Sturman. Pilot and of course, she helped ideologically to show that women could fight in combat, and her sister Vera, she was present on presentation of research results. But I think she absolutely also shows that to become famous, you should be victim. She became, in this gender nation tensions, she became famous in media when she were like victim of this imprisonment, of this problematic so-called relationships of Ukraine and Russia. We could see how she is using these national symbols, and unfortunately, so she became like female hero. But what we see, what her destiny is now when she returned, and of course she suffered from this post-war trauma, but she didn't get any, didn't want any break. She went immediately to politics. She was criticizing her party, bloc of Yulia Tymoshenko, and in general other military. And we could see how she was very quickly deheroized. as she became hero also very quickly. The same was her backlash, and this is the problem with this. I think with this discourse of heroism, that heroes are mainly those in war, like cybers, those who have a threat of death or who died, and the same as with Euromaidan, whom we know first of all, yes, like Heavenly Hundred, and but I think it's we analyzed also media representations of women. And of course, Nadia Savchenko, when we Google, for example, she is the most famous. Tatiana Rachkovska, another one famous volunteer, and she was the second. And Maria Berlinska, it's the person who initiated this research. She, the third one, popular figure for media representation of women.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for your interesting talk. So I'm interested because women don't only face discrimination from men, but also from other women. And given that this is a small minority of women in society, I was wondering what responses they faced from other women. So their experiences, were they perceived as radicals? And did they have problems with socialization afterwards? Because as we heard when we were talking about men, many of the men who come back from war, they can't go back to their jobs because they don't feel like they have a place there. How did that affect these women socializing with other women? And is this perhaps why they went into politics, as a form of socializing with one another and maintaining those relationships?
Yeah, thanks a lot. You're absolutely right. Discrimination is a much wider problem, and this the phenomenon that you pointed out, it's called internal misogyny, where women hate women, yeah, where there is lack of female solidarity. Of course, it could be a problem, but what I see around volunteer and military discourse, that now there are NGOs who try to train women, not for some combatant, but in general. Yes, recently we've got more discussions on gender-based violence. In the Ukrainian summer, it was this very huge online flash mob, I'm not afraid to say, я не боюсь сказати, initiated by Nastya Melnichenko, volunteer who is working with veterans of ATO. And I see recently that actually women support women more. And I see more NGOs that try to work with in different cities, with different women who are more inclusive, who are not working only like, like for example, Femin as an NGO that I respect from one hand, but it's very homogeneous women where only the same women with beautiful body were inside this NGO. But what we see in other groups, that they include women of different age, maybe like also of different background. So I see positive changes. As for resocialization of those women, unfortunately we didn't follow, but what I could say is that from our 42 respondents, 4 wanted to make a military career, only 4. But others, they say that they will return to normal life, but they don't know when, because some say that they will wait until war will finish. And not all of them are eager to fight for they said during interview that they don't have plans to fight for the status of veterans of ATO. But I think as far as, for example, there is this NGO in Dnipro on female veterans. So probably there are more, I think there is support from for military women, for other military women, but it's quite new. I think it's quite new issue, and we need to wait a couple of years to research it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have a question.
Thank you for a fascinating study, and I think just to preface my comment, it really mirrors the experience of women in the armed forces, of much more institutionalized, Western armed forces, where there may be no legal limit to women's presence in what they would call the combat arms, but there's a lot of internal process, such as steering them towards logistical, financial position. And so that exists in armed forces that are under much less stress than the Ukrainian armed forces. It's quite interesting. But my question is about the state response to that campaign overall, the Invisible Battalion. In your conclusion, you've shown that there was an opening of 68 official positions and some, let's say, some small progress and movement. Do you think that at this stage, from the perspective of the Ministry of Defense, Interior Affairs of Ukraine, they are largely responding to pressure from women's group, or are they actually seeing either an instrumental value, so it's good public relations? I'm sure, when Canada and US gives logistical help to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, they like to see those kind of women involvement. It looks good. But do you think they are starting to see some value, some actual value as women as patriots, as really engaged in the fight? And the Ukrainian state needs all the help it can get. So how are they perceiving it?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think that first of all, Ministry of Defense, as part of state, they perceive, as we could see this in history of wars, women as reserve labor force. Like in the situation when there are problems with this normal draft or conscription, where men are not very eager to go and join army, so why not to take women, those who want? And of course, state, even in some, we could see some propaganda, like I could say more propaganda movies or videos where on International Women's Day, 8th of March, I think it was 2014, they showed the video how women trained. And of course, when men watch this, and the notion is that, look, men, even women are doing this. They're snipers, they are doing this combat thing, so why you are not going? So I think as a general notion, of course, to make army more professional. And actually, like ideologically, this research initiator, Maria Berlinska, she says, and as a person with experience, she says that she is for professional, paid army, open for everybody who wants to join. And but at the same time, of course, there is pressure, international pressure, because our research. It was supported by UN Women, and also some women. We have this interfractional group, Equal Opportunities, in our parliament, and so they supported this. And Ministry of Defense, so they try step by step, but it's very, I think it's not like radical. It's step by step rights that you try to take, but from the very beginning, of course, Ministry was quite critical. This research was rather criticized by everybody, like radical nationalist groups, because women are nice, beautiful creatures, and it's not their role. By some my left colleagues who would say that you are fighting for the right of women to kill, so you support army, you support this war. So your research is like ideologically problematic, and we had these debates because for me it's first of all labor rights that women, and it's women who ask for help. So it's not we as a researcher come to them. And for Ministry of Defense and other armed forces, of course, they were coming and they were saying that no, there are any problems. There are women in armed forces, because in Ukrainian post-Soviet army, that was not very well financed, not prestigious, really a lot of women. According to our data, in 2008, for example, this contract army, women 40%, because it was very low paid, and of course men didn't want to take this position. So Ministry of Defense, they would say that, look, everything is okay. They were bringing the official from military women who were also standing and saying that there are any discrimination. But when we ask who are those women, psychologist, logistic, lower position, but step by step, I think due to also quite large media attention and media support, there is some, I think, cooperation. NATO was organizing some events on this issue, and I think NATO officials, they were positively surprised how those women who are volunteers, they are very publicly, openly criticize armed forces because they are not in the structure and they could do this.
We have time for one brief question and one brief answer.
A quick question. I may have misunderstood. You talked about the forbidden professions. Is it just the military, or are there forbidden professions or jobs in the civilian sector? And if so, what are they?
In Ministry of Health has this decree about the list of forbidden professions for women, and it's more than, I think, 500. Among them, I usually use driving and driver as an example, because in Ukraine, officially women can drive tram and trolley bus. They can't drive bus with seats of more than 14 passengers. They can't drive train, and they can't drive subway train. And some agriculture vehicles, and there are some regulations which weight you can lift, and it's 7 kilos. If women in their work constantly lift some weight, it's 7 kilos. So sometimes military outfit is more weight, so it's a problem with the 7. And it's paternalistic. Our labor legislation, it's Soviet legacy from one hand, and we know that in history, of course, women were fighting for their rights also as mothers, for these reproductive rights, but now we could see that it's too paternalist, with all this list of professions and other, actually with night works, because it's also a problem with night shifts, and to be sent to business trip. I think the most problematic issue is that women with kids before 3 are not supposed to be sent to business trips, and it's a problem how employer, how they treat this. And they would, if the job is well paid, but it has a lot of business trips, so he or she would rather hire men not to have problems with all this labor legislation. There is whole chapter, labor of women, with all these paternalist issues, and somehow it's very difficult to change, and Ministry of Social Policy, Ministry of Health, they're not very eager to discuss this. Ministry of Defense is more eager. But they would refer on those ministries and would say that they also follow the civilian legislation. And there are a lot of problems with them, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you, Tamara.